Hello and welcome to the After Party. Your hosts are Jared George and Jason Köhne. The Honors Roll Call highlights and celebrates those who have conscientiously committed to monthly gifts in my work for White Wellbeing. And appearing on the Honors Roll Call are Arvan Diggle, Hendrickson, JP and Pete, and Yaz, and Promethean Epoch. I am most grateful that there are people like yourselves who are driven by a sterling character and sense of destiny. Please be sure to thank these people if you are not one of them. Now, as for the crown winner of last week, the crown goes to Sean, I think a first-time winner, for gifting a total of 100 Prometheus Rising dollars. Adulations and plaudits to you. In second place was a crowd favorite, Angharad Celtic, gifting $30. Thank you as well, and congratulations. Financially gift on Entropy, which will be up in just a moment, where you can also watch the stream, ask and vote on questions, or you also have the option of Cash App. Jared and I evenly share the financial gifts with our guests here on the After Party. Today, we are honored to have a perspicacious thinker and honorable man, John Q. Publius, on tap. Welcome, John. Please introduce yourself to our esteemed community and tell them where they can find you and the work that you are doing. And then the Reverend Mr. George will take us into the conversation.
Well, okay. Good to be back. I think this is maybe number 4, something like that.
At least, yes.
It's got to be something like that. You can find me on Twitter at anatomically okay. Somehow still ticking there. Don't know how or for how long, but you can also go to my blog at the Anatomically Correct Banana, where I publish stuff by myself and other dissident authors, and you can find a lot of my writing at the Occidental Observer.
Very good, and welcome. I'm looking on the afterparty.tv right now, actually, for how many times you've been on, because as folks know, hey, if you want to see if someone's been on or a topic's been addressed, you just go to that search bar, the magnifying glass on the side, and let's see. Of course, you've joined us for birthday specials, but your own shows, let's see, you've done 3 taps and an after hours. So total, this would be 5th, I believe. I feel like there's even been more, but maybe it's because of the birthday shows. But yes, you are one of our most frequent guests. It is always great to talk to you. Jason and I were very impressed where we felt like we just spoke to you about the main book, which I've shown some people, by the way. And
Thank you.
And now I start seeing you're tweeting about this new book. You'd been telling us, you had told us and gave us a little preview of it on previous shows. And we're really excited about it because this is like your big 30,000-foot view, but also dive in to a system and the whole way of life and thought that pervades much of society and politics today. The anti-white ideology, sometimes called liberalism. And there's a lot to get into, of course. But first, we do just want to briefly touch on the censorship angle. We know a lot of people got deplatformed recently, and your book was taken off of Amazon almost as soon as it hit. So why don't you tell us a little bit about that?
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm a little bit surprised that actually that was the one they went after and not the main one. I don't know if it's just maybe it had a different kind of a reach or audience or what the case may be. I do go pretty hard on Amazon in the book. So maybe someone saw the contents and was like, this guy rips on us quite a bit in here. So maybe we shouldn't be selling this on our platform. But in any case, they sent a notification to the publisher, which is Black House Publishing. They're based out of London. They're a different publisher than carried the main book. Ostara Publications carried the main book. And these guys, they're over there in the UK. So because of some of the free speech, First Amendment stuff, you have to phrase things a little bit more delicately. than you might in other venues, because the publisher can actually be liable under a lot of their quote unquote hate speech laws over there for things that you say. So I was a little surprised actually, but nevertheless, some activist who works for Amazon flagged it as I'm trying to remember the exact verbiage, but it was something like an unpleasant consumer experience or something. They didn't get into any more detail than that. So obviously something in there they found objectionable, and so they kicked it off. Amazon, yeah, within a few weeks. I want to say mid to late May is when it officially hit, and then there was a little bit of a delay, obviously, with all the coronavirus stuff. And the same has occurred with the other book, both with the printer and with the distribution. It's taking weeks, sometimes even months, for people, unfortunately, to get copies, just because of the way things are right now, and all the civil unrest, which we'll of course talk about later on. But yeah, it's an ongoing thing. I mean, it's not like I haven't been censored before. Jared, this, having done a piece for Public Standard, that platform was totally deplatformed actually by the provider, and I've had some kind of search engine shenanigans with the blog and things of that nature. But this is the first really heavy-handed censorship I've seen. And, the other reason I was a little surprised it was this book and not the other one is the other one has a foreword by Kevin MacDonald. And of course, they booted his Culture of Critique off Amazon. So you can still get both titles at Barnes & Noble or through the publishers. But it's a pretty egregious display of censorship. And, of course, they don't have the spine, I guess we could say, or it's actually pretty central to the system, which I do talk about in the book, is the fact that they never call a spade a spade. Nothing's ever direct. It's always underhanded misdirection done in the shadows. It's a kind of a soft power, but it's very insidious because of the way they do it. So they're not going out and they're having book burnings. They just quietly tell you something in the 300 plus pages you've written is objectionable. What? Don't know. And it's not welcome on their platform.
Yeah, this is like people having cops show up at their homes in the UK. It sounds like it was quick because of, as you mentioned, the publisher being based in the UK, but who really knows, of course. But we've seen videos of, people filming back with the police, having a polite enough conversation, but being asked to come down to a station because of offensive tweets. And apparently, for any of our listeners in the UK, definitely look into the laws there, because apparently if you go down to the station and you admit in your own words that someone somewhere could have found it offensive, well, this is in England actually, then there could be some kind of repercussions. I don't know how serious. I don't know if it's a fine or even worse. In Scotland, apparently, someone was saying, I forget, Jason, I don't even know, was this on a show? Someone was telling me this last week, or maybe both of us, that in Scotland, you don't even have to admit that the post you authored might be found offensive by someone else. All that has to happen is someone else can say they found it offensive. So it's like a one-person heckler's veto kind of thing, just insane. But actually, before we get into the book, one more thing. Didn't you say that you're already working on a third book?
Yeah. So the genesis of this one chronologically in writing it, actually, much of it predates the main book. I've been working on it for a while.
Yeah, the one we're about to talk about.
Yeah,
which is called, for our listeners again, which is called
The God That Failed, Liberalism and the Destruction of the West. Thank you. I'm always bearing the lead. They optioned the manuscript at Ostara with the main book. It kind of took shape very quickly, and I wasn't really super confident about getting something together in a book format. I always kind of thought of myself as an online author.
Yeah, well, that was things like that. You had a lot of the material because it was a series of articles, and we had you on originally in October to speak about the articles because we found them so extraordinary.
Yeah, and it caught fire, and obviously I expanded the material dramatically from those articles, but through Dr. MacDonald's encouragement and just synthesizing all that stuff, I fleshed it out and put all of it together and kind of put the other one on the back burner. And then I went back to, having picked up some more confidence, went back to this other manuscript and started incorporating a lot of the economic stuff that I hadn't really addressed. And the book, The Way Life Should Be, does talk a bit about the economic impetus and the ideological impetus, but that is more of a case study, which has some broader conclusions, as opposed to this one being a broader outline, the bird's eye view, with then some more specific examples. So they're kind of like two sides of the same coin. They're both complementary. You don't have to read one to understand the other, but they do kind of go hand in hand. And the third book that I'm working on gets more into the guts of social control, the media apparatus, how to kind of borrow from Chomsky, the quote unquote elites manufacture consent, and how they're able to do some of these things and engineer populations and push through a lot of the concepts and ideological things that we find objectionable and actually repulsive on a base level, but how they're able to do that.
Right.
And ideally I want to do a series. I might have mentioned this on here before. Ideally I want to do like a whole series of books, each kind of addressing some crucial aspect of this system. And so The God That Failed is very important because that gives you the really broad outline. It says, here are the things that animate this ideology. Here's where it comes from. And here are the effects that we can see. And I sort of prognosticate a little bit from there. And it's not to use the kind of online parlance, it's not like a black pill fest. I mean, there's a lot of hard conclusions in there, but I'm not like, a negative person, nor am I unrealistic about the state of things. But I do need to present the reality as it is.
Right. Sounds like they flow all these books when the third one comes out, and whatever comes after flow into each other well, complement each other well. Now that you're saying it, I do remember you speaking a little about the themes of the third book. I think maybe on the our birthday show back in February, you mentioned it. But why don't we get into it now? So The God That Failed. Now, liberalism, we know, is a broad term. And I've heard some people, when they get into more scholarly discussions about this, talk about how it meant different things at different times. Obviously, it's a stand-in for what we call the neoliberal order now, which is obviously an anti-white ideology, frame of looking at life, morality system, whole thing. So you said you break it down into two general aspects in the book, ideological and economic. So why don't we'll begin to go through the ideological first, and then we'll get to the economic as well.
Yeah, absolutely. So the ideological aspect, I point out the great irony of the fact that the ideological basis of this system originates from European males, even though it's being weaponized against European males. And it comes out of the tradition of the Enlightenment and different perspectives on humanity and human nature and ideal governance and all that kind of thing. But it kind of takes on a life of its own, and you get some sentimental ideas about human nature, about the nature of things, about the order of things. I personally tend to think that European civilization hit a zenith in the Renaissance, where we were much more cognizant of things being in balance, of symmetry, proportion. And there was this idea of a well-rounded, well-realized individual rather than more of a specialized cog in the machine, which I guess is more of a consequence of the Industrial Revolution. And a lot of these things.
Would you mind if I ask something at this juncture?
Sure.
Just because it's such a big topic, we're gonna just kind of have to jab in some questions. It sounds like there's some complementary thought there with something we talk about a lot, and I know Kevin McDonald, who wrote the foreword for your first book, as you said, his new book series is going to be about this, about us. Do you think, or do you write about this in the book, that that two-edged sword of our empathy, and especially because the world was more insular back then, of course, it was much easier for our philosophers and thinkers to project our best self-image onto the whole world. And I still struggle with this sometimes, because I'm kind of open, creative temperament just by nature. And you want to still think in terms of humanity and things like that, just humanity, humankind. But there's obviously, like anything, there are boundaries to that. There are limits to that. So do you think it has a root in kind of our good nature and just thinking, I mean, as much as it's being lambasted now, some of our colonial pursuits were really with noble intentions to bring more enlightened ideals. Obviously, a lot of it was Christianity and medicine and technology to the rest of the world, etc.
Yeah, I would definitely say so. And I actually dedicate quite a bit of the book to talking about the introspective factor. Okay, like what brought us here. And I think that it's important to understand all of the external factors that have imperiled us. But there is something, and my thesis is that it's in the genome of Occidental man that makes us more susceptible to certain appeals of emotion, to empathy. And there's actually the evidence that I provide is a lot of it's fairly scientific, and it gets into the fact that there are genes that code for elevated empathetic responses, and the Western population has these in much higher proportion than any other population. And we're not sure if it's a consequence of the Neanderthal DNA or what it is, but certainly we evolved a lot of this more cooperative, altruistic kind of genetic material, particularly the northwestern half of Europe. And, you know, McDonald, you're right, does talk quite a bit about this.
Does anybody else here?
I was going to say, was it just me? I lost John.
Yes, we don't hear you at all now, John. Are you there?
Let me message him in case he doesn't realize.
Okay, yes. Well, we are here. I will turn to the question avatar over on Entropy. And we have Volkish Warrior asking this. Jason, the people demand to know what happened to Lamont Riddick. Don't you dare dodge the question. Please, brother, help a fellow white born in a barn. I don't know that tonight Tap would be the right place for any discussion about that, but we will nonetheless. I will cover that. I will speak to those questions probably on a Sunday, a going free. We'll address that. Be a more apropos place to do so. But as we wait to get out, and it looks like he's already back.
Leaving and coming back in. Yeah.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
We sure can, brother. Continue where you left off.
All right. I apologize. I don't know what's going on here with the internet.
Maybe it's that same flagger at Amazon.
It wouldn't even surprise me. So I think where I dropped out was the genetic component, roughly.
Yes, exactly.
So we have higher concentrations of this, and again, it depends on where you occur, where your genetic material comes from, as far as these three different waves that kind of went over the European continent. Whether you have more predisposition to this kind of openness, cooperative, relatively weaker kinship ties, that kind of thing. And that does make us more susceptible to subversion through appeals to like sentimentality, to universality, all of those things. I get into that. The intersection also with Christianity is another major factor. The Christian universalism is actually very damaging in many cases to us, where in the Middle Ages and into the Renaissance, and actually even in the early days of Christianity, the faith had actually been made to adapt to Europeans, not the other way around. So there's this kind of paradox too, where you have the tending towards universality of Christianity among some that we see with a lot of like mainline Protestants and evangelicals, and then with a lot of people, a kind of irreligiosity that they then transfer into quote unquote social justice. So you have that aspect, you have a lot of material excess, which makes people really easy to subvert, and you have kind of the cyclical late stage empire blues that afflict pretty much every major civilization on its downward trajectory throughout human history. So there's a lot of factors kind of all coalescing at once. There's no one thing necessarily, although there are obviously very harmful actors who are exacerbating certain things and weaponizing our own tendencies against us. And that's something we have to be very aware of. And the way I put it is it's similar to someone who has a bad temper. You have to be aware of the fact that you have a quick trigger or a bad temper, and you really have to actively work on those character flaws. And it's not really a flaw necessarily, but it can become pathological, this idea of pathological altruism, if the guardian function, as I talked about, becomes disabled, and kind of the immune system is down. You're not able to purge these harmful elements, be they people or concepts, out of your body, so to speak. And so we have to be aware of the fact that we can be taken in by sentimentality and by this kind of one worldism much more so than, say, the Japanese or whomever. And that's something we have to actively be aware of and police for. But it's the same way, like a person has a character flaw or some tendency that they have that they need to break. So like as a population, obviously the orthodoxy, this kind of egalitarian thing, makes that very difficult for people, because they're, especially people who are white, because you're told not to think of yourself in that way. You're sort of just a generic human. Although I call it equality with an asterisk, because every other group is told, yeah, be proud of your heritage, be proud of who you are, celebrate multiculturalism and all that. So it's this very weird paradox where you have this idea of we're kind of this blank slate, nothing sort of thing. We have no culture of our own, what have you. But we're also uniquely to blame for all the world's evils. And so it's really mutated. And I try to kind of track this through the book, where it has evolved over time. This idea of liberalism started out as a kind of debate between the character of good and ideal governance. And you have borrowing from people like Locke and those sorts of things. And we talked about before we started recording that we were going to talk about the French and American revolutions at some point. It's kind of a reflection of this idea, but there are different iterations of what liberalism comes to mean. And it has kind of evolved. And the really key thing, it's hard. I broke it down to be more digestible for people to understand it more into ideological and economic. But I did really want to underscore the point that they are, the way it stands, inextricably intertwined. So you can't just focus on one or the other if you want the whole picture. And different people will agree or disagree on what those exacerbating factors are and what the most harmful factors are. Certain people maybe tend more towards the ideological or more towards the economic. I think for a long time, I was tending towards the economic being more destructive. But I think given all the madness we're seeing in the kind of the cultural revolution we're living through right now, I'm sort of swaying back towards ideological, but they work hand in hand.
So you're not one who would countenance someone saying, but that's not real liberalism, like a Sargon type looking to the classical, I think of Locke. You mentioned Locke. You have to think of Sargon, one of his favorite guys to mention, or at least used to be. I don't know. I don't listen to Sargon, but remember the debates with him from a couple years ago with our guys. And it's just like all the other stuff, like the jokes, the memes about communism, this isn't real communism. That's not real communism. So you think this was baked into the cake from the start, and that there's no way around it.
Yeah, and not only
just
that,
the trajectory of it.
Yeah, exactly. And basically, for me, anytime a materialist ideology supersedes the well-being of your group or the interests of your group, that's a problem. So I am equally opposed to unbridled capitalism, and the same way I am with communism. Like, to me, both systems are unworkable in terms of as an ideology. So a lot of Republicans in the United States and a lot of conservatives in the UK and a lot of these parties, they take the economic aspect as conservatism. So like free market liberal, they're basically Whig liberals who are like all about the free market, this laissez-faire idea. Well, that's not conservative, because as we can see, these companies then get carte blanche, like Amazon and Twitter, to censor you if they want to. So there's no respect for the First Amendment or the Constitution in general. And this is kind of the push, and I cover this a bit in The Way Life Should Be, but the privatization of a lot of this stuff, including resources, I focus more on there, and refugee resettlement. Those are the two I focus more on there. But there's a lot of this privatizing and outsourcing. The governments are totally accountable in many ways to these multinationals, these financial institutions. They're really all intertwined to the point where there's, to my mind, there's not really much use in distinguishing if it's the government or the United Nations or Wells Fargo that's the problem. They're all working together, and they are all the problem. And that's
right.
the thing.
there's a symbiosis amongst them.
Yeah,
Yes,
exactly.
Anything else under the broad ideological heading before we get into the economic? What else is discussed in that area of the book?
Well, I think the other key aspect is the guilt complex, and I think that kind of does go along with the Christianity thing. But Occidental culture tends to police itself using guilt rather than shame, and so certain things, this kind of shared guilt, this Catholic guilt, which is where the kind of irreligiosity aspect comes in. So if it's transferred out of original sin, this idea of like Catholic guilt or that sort of thing, when it's transferred into this so-called social justice, that's all those impulses are there, but they're weaponized for things that are deeply, deeply harmful. And again, as a population, we are more susceptible to guilt as opposed to shame. And there's a long-standing tradition of that. And one of the conclusions that I draw is that is also a genetic thing. So it really is. It's as I said.
Do you have a quick back of the envelope way to delineate between those two?
Well, I guess the way I would put it is your mother says something like, "I'm not mad, I'm just disappointed," rather than making you go out on the street and wear a placard that says, I came in late from past my curfew. And you may still be embarrassed, but the mortification aspect, the idea that like in Japanese culture, someone would even go so far as to commit suicide for bringing shame on their family, their lineage, that kind of thing. Whereas guilt's more of an internal thing. It tends to be more, it's not totally individualistic, of course, but it does tend to be more on an individual basis where the person takes that in. And it's a much more effective way of using our genetic factors of policing things. And again, when that's weaponized, it becomes deeply, deeply harmful.
Do you have any thoughts on how that reflects a different consciousness as well, that we're more inward?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, the highest percentage of innovation and creativity is found within the Western genome. And I think that kind of introspection, it's kind of like
look that up on YouTube, though. Check with YouTube. They have all the facts.
Right, of course. I think that we are right in this kind of mix where we have that Spengler called it the Faustian spirit, the idea of like striving to know and understand and categorize and explore and create and innovate. I mean, this is it's especially pronounced in our population. It's something, we may not have the highest tested IQs relative to other groups, but in terms of just sheer accomplishments, it definitely is within our realm because of the way that we are. And it is, again, it's one of those things that's baked into the cake. It's just a part of the uniqueness of our civilization. And it also goes into, again, we tend to be more individualistic, and therefore the idea that we would bring shame on our ancestors, I mean, it's something that should, and disgrace our name. It's something that should matter and does affect people, but not in the same way that it would with a lot of the East Asian cultures. The idea that that's kind of, their level of individualism would be much lower. And there would be more of a sense of a collective, which is why, generally speaking, Korea and Japan and a lot of these countries have been able to resist the mass appeals for immigration and refugee resettlement, because they think more in terms of the health of the collective rather than the individual. I mean, Japan is still a very capitalistic society, but it hasn't proven susceptible in the same way. Even I wrote recently in an article for Occidental Observer, even Eastern Europe is starting to import large numbers of quote unquote guest workers, which is exactly how all this stuff started in every other Western country. Yeah, it's bad.
Yeah.
Well, I have a quick question, John. Has there ever been, to your knowledge, another point in history where Western man grappled with and defined this two-edged sword of our empathy? Or is this the first time? Do you think maybe that this is just another turn, another evolution in our story? Has it ever happened before, or did it take a globalized world to make us realize this? We are not hearing you, my friend. Is that Amazon employee is messing with your ISP?
No, it looks like John is muted right now, but not on my end. It's on his end, and he is gone.
Gonna pop out.
He pop out, and he will pop back in. We hope, and we shall see him in just a moment. Perhaps his microphone will be even better when he returns this time.
I will say on your behalf, because I know sometimes we all have to be our own. You have to believe in yourself first, but it does sometimes it's just a little more powerful coming from someone else. That spirit of us is very well defined in Jason's story in Prometheus Rising. You see the innovation and the inward nature, its positive and negative aspects, and how we must always be mindful of keeping those in balance.
Very, very well said, and thank you so much for that, Jared. And we have John back. And John, I was going to ask you. Actually, John was responding to your question, Jared. Please, John, continue.
Well, sorry, I guess this is what happens when you get out of the city a little bit.
It's okay. It makes the show a little more dynamic.
Well, where did I leave off?
Right, I had asked you. We didn't hear anything after I asked the question about if we've ever had a juncture in our history where we had to face this before, with the grappling with our empathy and having people stand up and say, hey, this is something we need to watch out for, like your anger management example before.
Well, probably the closest example that I've been able to come up with historically would be the events of 376 AD, where there was a massive, basically army of Goths fleeing the Huns, and they were at the Danube, and they were basically shouting to the Romans there, please let us in, we fear persecution, the Huns are coming. Now, the Huns were in fact coming. It wasn't totally engineered, but this is a basically ready-made army. Now, they traveled, they had women and children with them because that's how they traveled. So it was basically this massive horde. And so eventually it was decided, okay, well, we'll settle them in what's now kind of the Balkan region. And that, out of compassion, out of empathy, and that proceeded to backfire spectacularly as they went and looted and raided for years and years, and actually killed, I believe it was the Eastern Roman Emperor was actually killed in battle 2 years following. So the consequences were very dire. Now, Rome was kind of falling apart at this point. It had already split itself in half. Now, the eastern half eventually came out of things okay, at least for the next 1,000 years or so. But this empathy, this empathetic response, I think it's made much worse. That's the closest parallel I can think of. It's made much worse, though, with the omnipresence of mass media, television, and all that kind of stuff, and the rigorous indoctrination from compulsory schooling and all these other things. So I think this is the most pronounced. It's not something that I think happens regularly. I think this is unique in its kind of pervasiveness. And I think it's the first time we've seen a group. I mean, kind of going back to Spengler, he's talked about at the ends of eras, you see kind of death cults and things start proliferating, and there's a palpable sense that the civilization is kind of dying. But the idea that it's just a society-wide, or let's say a third of society, half society, a good percentage of society actively facilitating its own destruction, I think that that's wholly without precedent. And with some historical outliers, it's generally unusual to encounter a ruling class who actually is going out of their way to replace their own people. I think, again, the closest parallel, you could look to some things in Rome. Rome kind of, after the founding families, it kind of died off. In the early 200s AD, you kind of had this more of a, I guess, civic nationalist idea of Romanness, which obviously did not work out. And then you fast forward quite a ways to the USSR, where they actually did take different ethnic groups and move them around and try to intermix them to create this new Soviet man, where you didn't have a particular ethnic identity. You were subservient to this engineered ideology, basically. But as all of it kind of together, I think this is unique in some ways, even though there are quite a few parallels in earlier versions in some respects or others.
Yeah, I think very well said. One of the scary things about parallels to previous epochs is the desecration and destruction, and in fact, the symbolic hanging of statues, the beheading of statues, all of white people. And this is, we have seen, is the precursor to the infliction of similar atrocities on those whom the simulacra represent. And of course, that would be us, the Western kind. We do have this individualism, and I agree with you that it has been really exacerbated, and so has our empathy. We haven't always we clearly have some sort of inclination that served us well at some point in history as Western kind. But this, like Mr. George was alluding to in Prometheus Rising, actually, we talk about how there are strengths and weaknesses, both of which are used against us, and it's demonstrated how that is used against us and how we can guard against them being used against us. So these strengths and these weaknesses are exploited by the anti-whites in our midst. And so we see the parallel of the strengths and weaknesses in our people. And yet, even, for example, the individualism has served us well, but now it's been taken beyond the point of being able to serve us into this ideology of hyper-individualism. And we see this in a number of these, like libertarian and all of its afterbirth offspring ideologies that are connected to it, that make virtuous the idea of standing alone by oneself, standing with one's property as though that is the contents of one's life, rather than as a piece of a larger body of one's people. And we see, and you're talking about right there, and I'd like to have you speak to it maybe a little bit more, any other thoughts you might have on the issue that the non-white races of the world fabulously find their individual well-being by way of their group's well-being. And so that's makes it easy for places like Japan, places like Saudi Arabia, these wonderful places, far superior to everything we build in the West, obviously. But nonetheless, that's what makes them immune to these ideas that would inflict injury on the body of their people, but at the same time give their people, give their individuals a way out of the injury, which of course is only temporary. And we see that a great example of the way out that you get as a white person is the traditional and original meaning to the phrase white flight. People who had the money would move a little bit further, and the rest of our people would be stuck. They would end up being subjected to the biospirits of other peoples, crime rates and the like. But eventually you can't move out far enough. Eventually you see that you become victim to this. So we see that it is ends up being a great failing by pursuing this path that allows for the body of our people to be harmed, but for the individual to escape the harm. And so if you could please speak a little bit more to that, because I think there's more meat on that bone about the hyper-individualism and how this is a problem for our people, and that if we learn to do what the non-white peoples do naturally, which is pursue our individual well-being by way of our group's well-being, we will be infinitely healthier, wealthier, etc. For it. Please, brother.
Yeah, absolutely. And you saw, for example, a lot of the kind of whining about it in Italy where the coronavirus hit. Oh, well, it's being transmitted more because of multi-generational households, as though that's a bad thing. Well, the transmission of the virus is obviously a terrible thing, but it was used as like an example of how that doesn't work. Whereas in Sweden, I want to say like half of households are single person households. I mean, it's a very taken to the kind of two poles of the European experience. But this was kind of taken as evidence, this man-made virus taken as evidence that, this is not a good thing and we can't have this. And the non-multi-generational household is very much the historical outlier, not what Italy is a bit of an outlier in the modern European context, in modern Western context in that form, but that's not really that weird for all intents and purposes. That was only made possible really after the Second World War and this explosion in American wealth and industry, and that's only sustainable for a couple generations. So we're seeing now, as the economy starts contracting, a lot of people who are in their 30s even moving in with their folks. And that's not necessarily a bad thing. I mean, it's actually, I'm always trying to find the silver lining in things. And the downside to that, obviously, that multi-generational household thing for Italy was that there were more casualties because of elderly people who are subjected to this virus. However, we don't want that to, to destroy the way of life and then have that in Italy, by the way, that has been much more resistant to a lot of this globalism stuff than has Sweden. So people who are kind of cleaved off and isolated and individualistic, they're much easier to control, to program, to find meaning in consumer products and social justice causes, as opposed to family and community and those kinds of things. And you do see that there's much more of a sense in the Mediterranean and in Eastern Europe of that communal spirit. And a lot of that has to do with these population waves that I talked about earlier.
Yeah, they were closer. They were closer to all. Those are the first places that peoples from Africa or Middle East would come to. So the Scandinavia is kind of the gated community of Europe.
Right, right. And actually, interestingly enough, the Scandics in actually Sweden, it was like scientists have pegged it at around 7700 BC that white skin became a population-wide feature there. That's actually the first place that was considered like an evolved trait. Now, that is where the tendency to weaker kinship and reciprocity and that kind of thing is going to be most pronounced. And obviously, because of the waves of Viking settlement / attack throughout the kind of Norman area and the British Isles, you're going to see much more of a predisposition to that there as well, because there's a lot of genetic admixture in the British populations from Scandinavia. So, so you'll see different degrees of that, and there's kind of the last overlay is this kind of warrior-like steppe people who come from, I want to say, about 2500 BC, who are much more hierarchical, but that's really where the core of the kind of Faustian spirit comes in. And European peoples, as I mentioned, they're kind of a mix of all those three things in different concentrations, plus add a little Neanderthal in there. So there's a lot going on. And, we're not a uniform block, but again, we tend towards certain things like the weaker kinship. As I said, you find less of that the kind of more southeastern you go. But it's not a thing that it's not like it's unheard of in Ireland or in Norway for there to be multi-generational households. Again, this is a more modern phenomenon made possible by Western opulence to have a lot of these, and programming for that matter.
Can be very psychologically healthy for all the generations as well.
Yeah, definitely. And it's encouraged, this idea of moving for work and having to do all these things. This is encouraged by the establishment because it cleaves you off from your roots and it makes you much easier to control. I talk about this guy, Yuri Bezmenov, and now I've got all my books confused. I can't remember where I talk about him, but at some point in my writing, I talked about this guy. He was a Soviet defector, former KGB agent, and basically he talks about how, the person who's on his own land, his own farm, is going to fight the invader to the last bullet. The city person probably is going to help them come in. They don't really have that kind of, this is not obviously every city person or every country person. The idea, though, is that cosmically they're sort of estranged from the essence of things, from the production of things, from the substance. So there are a lot of people out there who still have great instincts, obviously, and they're city people, or by necessity they have to live in the city, but they've grown estranged somewhat from the cycle of things, from their family connections, from their communities where, generations and generations of their ancestors have been buried, lived, what have you. And that's very disruptive.
Absolutely. Yeah. I mean, it's dwindled, but in American cities, there were people who were there for generations. And yes, they were city dwellers, and there's certain things about city way of life. And like anything, you can look at advantages and disadvantages, but they were the natives. They were there for many generations. And that's a very different thing than someone watching a TV show and saying, I'm going to move to LA, or I'm going to move to New York and show everyone how hip and sophisticated I am. And that's a very, very different thing. I could definitely tell you from firsthand experience that native city dwellers versus people that just came there to prove a point, they're kind of two different breeds of the city person. So sometimes I think that's worth saying. But why don't we get into the other big chunk of your book, The God That Failed, on the economics now?
Yeah, no, that's a great point. It's a great distinction. And those are like the kind of economic migrants who go there. And, there was at one time, it's disappearing, but there was at one time very strong sense of, you're right, urban life and the way things would be in a city like Boston versus New York versus Philadelphia. Now they're kind of pretty much every Western city is being transformed into this like goop of anyone from anywhere. It could be anything, very generic. The buildings kind of change, but there's no sense of place.
Quick anecdote. A friend's mom had come over from Scotland and was very close to her, and she would always tell me when we were growing up, adolescence, this. She came here in the '60s from Scotland. She was about 20 years old at the time, and when she met the man who would become my friend's father, they were dating the same area, and he lived in a very homogenous area. And she would walk up the stairs in like a 3 or 4 flight small walk-up building, and it would take her, like when she got home from work or whatever she was doing, it would take her like an hour or more to get to her apartment, because I think she lived on the top floor, because everyone had their door open. Everyone would invite her in, taste a little of this food. Oh, we're having this for dinner. Do you want to stay? Talk about this. How was your day? Unfathomable in most of our cities today. It's absolutely devastating to think of what's been taken from us. Squatting Slav was back. It was on with us back in January. He talked about how that still exists in Serbia when he visits Belgrade every year, if anyone wants to check out that episode. But please continue with the economics.
Yeah, no, that's a great point too. I've noticed that in a lot of the Eastern, I'm fortunate to have traveled pretty widely around Europe, and I have noticed that in the Eastern European cities, you definitely still see that experience, and it's a pretty cool thing. But yeah, the economic impetus, I mean, that is a lot of what has driven people apart, and it's made much easier with the idea that life is relatively easy compared to that of our ancestors. So that allows a lot of delusions to take hold. It also allows people to, when these instincts are catered to sort of see themselves more through a prism of consumerism, or even their identity. So like I said, a lot of these things go hand in hand. So the idea that you would basically render the native population a blank slate that quote unquote doesn't have culture, which Justin Trudeau said about Canada, and there was like a Swedish minister who said about Sweden. A lot of these politicians, they say there's no core culture to these countries, which is obviously completely ridiculous. But once you've kind of washed that away and you've rendered the population a blank slate, well, then they find identity in things. They take that instinct is still there. And they take that instinct and then they put it into the local sports team. They put it into the music that they listen to, the fashion, the different brands, and they basically just become not greater than the sum of their parts, but less than the sum of their parts at best, because this is kind of a stunted humanity, right? Like too imperfect to be a machine, but not really fully realized as a human being. So retreating to vices for temporary pleasure, kind of a lot of sensuousness. Again, the Romans were very harshly critical about their own society descending into this kind of decadence, which they rightly saw as being the erosion of the foundation of the Republic, which eventually that is in fact what happened. It became the empire, and not long after it became the empire, as I mentioned, the founding families of Rome pretty much had stopped breeding. I mean, there's this famous story of Augustus urging the founding families, the high families of Rome, to breed for the love of God, have kids. There's no Rome. And so it's not like the demographic crisis has not happened before. They experienced very similar things in the sense that there was a lot of material prosperity. Things were relatively easy, and this is an easy way for people to be subverted. But again, as I mentioned, with the proliferation of a lot of technology, mass media, that kind of stuff, it's made that much easier. And then what you're able to do then is kind of shape people through a consumer lens. And what it also does is, because you have a large percentage of people who are untethered or don't really have roots, you can start untethering and uncoupling things from reality, all sorts of other things, like, money, which, the kind of popular meme of money machine go burr, like they just print money, like there's no real hard connection to anything. And you can take other aspects of identity, and they can be uncoupled from the reality as you experience it. And it's choose your own adventure, so long as it fits within the confines of what the ruling class is selling you. So those things are all issues. And I also talk about, a lot of the consumer products and things that were sold are things that are very destructive to our bodies, which obviously also impacts their psychological health and well-being. So the idea that there would be xenoestrogens and a lot of compounds in the plastics that we use that would drive down male's testosterone, which therefore makes it harder to be virile, to resist your displacement and objecting to things in a more stern fashion. It affects your neurochemistry. Again, all the things being interconnected. They know this. The people in charge know this. And the rhetoric that they use is anti-reality. It's everything that they're saying is basically the opposite of what is in fact the case. So you hear them talk about, like, pretty much anytime you hear someone kind of going on the economic front, going on and on about, markets and such, inevitably behind it, you've found something like the government has made some sweetheart deal for some vulture capitalist hedge fund to run something, or the Federal Reserve is behind some kind of shady machination or something like that. I mean, a lot of these mass protests happened right around the time that BlackRock was described. It's a few commentators have kind of described it as being the fourth branch of government. So BlackRock pretty much given carte blanche to do all these things. Well, the population's distracted by this basically media, and particularly media generated outrage, fake outrage. And the thing is, what struck me about this, a little bit of a tangent, and I apologize, but what struck me was they're using the exact same, and this is how indoctrinated the population is. They're using the exact same playbook as they used in 2014 with the I can't breathe stuff. The exact same thing. Do you remember this in 2014? There was the I can't breathe. It's the exact same thing. They're literally just trotted out the exact same thing they did 6 years ago to foment unrest, and they're taking down the monuments and stuff. And again, these are different figures. I heard stuff about, knock down Mount Rushmore and all this. That's the ideological aspect. The economic aspect, this stuff is encouraged by these companies who have they treat these population groups as an economic investment. And so I get into, in the book, I break it down with different identity groups, but this is actually how the business interests think of people. They think of them in terms of their identity groups and how they can exploit those identity groups for an economic impetus, using the biological considerations of that group and how that they can exploit that group, and in what ways they can exploit that group.
Let me ask an innocent question that someone new to this might ask then. If our people are still the majority population-wise, and it's only about dollars and cents to these corporations, why would they not be explicitly catering to us?
We are, especially white males, terrible consumers. So
I know I am. I keep things in pristine condition, and I don't rebuy things for years. Yeah, I don't buy into this whole cycle of, I gotta have the latest, greatest gadget.
Yeah, exactly. And the thing is, it sounds kind of like, it feels kind of icky saying it, but it's the truth. This is how the corporations view people. I'm not saying this is, whatever. They literally look at the demographic pie and they say, okay, well, the average dollar circulates for X amount of time in this population group versus this population group. This one has much higher time preference versus this one. So here's how we can rip them off using payday loan scams and marketing particular products to this group and all those kinds of things. And each different group, they use different strategies. They try to create this idea of what I talked about in there called the connected consumer, or it's the connected spender, but it's really the connected consumer. Because, again, everything that's connected, the media and the entertainment that people consume, they're inextricably intertwined with the products that they're consuming. So it's not just celebrity spokespeople and everything else. It's the ideological infusion in these mediums that they're looking at, who then go and they start pushing a political agenda on top of it. And there is actually, there's become an inflection point where people who are so indoctrinated and digitized, and this occurs in different levels with different population groups, you can probably guess it's most pronounced in by all the active, quote unquote, activism that's happening right now, who believes this. What their activism, their consumption, and their entertainment all become the same thing, and they are not able to differentiate between them. And so it literally becomes a state where they're basically acting out a fantasy. The fantasy and the reality have actually merged, and they become indistinguishable for these people. They're that firmly indoctrinated, and it's terrifying to think about the implications there. But that's the thing that they've been trying to cultivate for a very long time. And they'll look at a certain population group and they'll say, this group spends almost 8 hours a day watching television. Now, if you're sleeping 8 hours, then you're presumably you're working. I don't know. I guess maybe not. That's not who you are, but that's a ungodly amount of time to be consuming entertainment. So you put in all this messaging, you put in these products, you start mixing platforms between, social media and music and other things. And it all kind of feeds into this one overall Leviathan where all these things are, all these different entities are basically running cover for each other. They're supporting each other, and they work synergistically to create and reinforce and then continue to propagate the system. And the thing about neoliberalism is it's predicated on exponential growth. So it always needs to be growing the pie. It always needs to be growing the number of consumers, which is why you keep hearing things like, well, the United States could easily fit another 400 million people. It's like, why would anyone want another 400 million people here? Well, they want more consumers. But they run into a problem because the whole time they've been trying to suppress the native birth rates. So we're not reproducing. And unfortunately, from their perspective, what happens is a double-edged sword, because the people who become quote unquote westernized start adopting the features of the consumption where they start having less kids, they become invested in all these destructive ideologies. So they have to constantly be importing more people from abroad to fill this role. And so of its own design, it will fail eventually. It's just when and at what cost. It's a very, the people that are doing this are not concerned with the long term. It's beneficial to them in the short and medium term, though.
And how far back does that economic model go where it's based on that exponential growth instead of just trying to keep some kind of balance? There's fluctuations and cycles over years, but the way like a family budget might work. And hey, wow, thinking of the nation as an extended family. Crazy idea, I know.
Yeah, to me, it seems like there are some seeds of it in terms of the trade imbalance idea behind mercantilism, but I think the trying to like accrue as much gold bullion. But I think that generally, as I say in the book, the term neoliberalism was coined in 1938 with the meeting of a bunch of these leading kind of philosophers and economists, and they kind of split into two camps. One that was totally laissez-faire and one that thought it was okay for state, intervention and management. But the idea of the constantly growing the markets, I think it picks up steam probably maybe sometime in the 19th century, probably. For sure, the idea that importing lots of labor to keep wages down is an ongoing trend throughout industrialization. Organized labor throughout Canada, Australia, New Zealand, America, they all worked very hard to institute a lot of the quote-unquote racist immigration restrictions that we saw in the 19th and 20th centuries, because the big business interests were trying to import people to work for very cheap. So that aspect, as far as just constantly trying to grow the consumer base, though, I don't know that I can precisely pinpoint an exact moment, but we definitely see different aspects, such as in the 1920s with what they were marketing as women's liberation. You've just created a whole new class of consumer and wage depressors. So,
right.
In my opinion, it's not a coincidence that when you have the immigration restrictions and quotas in 1921 and 1924, you pretty much immediately get what's called the Great Migration, which is blacks out of the South into northern cities to work in factories. And you get, quote, women's lib, where you get women to go out, pay into the income tax. Income tax becomes enshrined in 1913. So probably somewhere around there. I don't know exactly when, but somewhere around there, I think you start seeing this idea of just more growth, exponential growth.
More consumers, right? And obviously, you talked about the Roman Empire before. It might not have been the same model, different structures, but ultimately, we've seen this play out before. Cheap labor. It's like we need not that writing things in constitutions are the end all be all, but we need to have it written somewhere. We need to teach our kids in school. Selling out to cheap labor is the death of empires. Now,
yep.
This could be a whole show in and of itself, but we have to get you to talk about the antecedents of all this in both the American and French revolutions and take it up to today. No small task, but if you could at least give us an overview of that, a little taste of that.
Sure, yeah, I'll give it the old college try. Well, to my mind, you kind of have the consequence of this idea of liberalism, and this is kind of what basically explodes the whole thing, is you have two separate revolutions not far apart in the American Revolution and the French Revolution. And the American Revolution is very much based on this contractual notion. It's an extremely Anglo-Saxon idea of a contract between the government and the governed. The problem with this, and Tom Sunich has talked about this, the idea of like Americanism, it is the contractual nature is baked into the cake. So there's no ultimate, despite the Naturalization Act of 1790, which a lot of us point to, there is this notion of rights as opposed to obligations. There's a notion of, again, this contractual aspect where different people can be enfolded here. They can pursue life, liberty, and happiness, right? So, or proper, right? What is it? Property? I don't know. I can't remember. But property's in there somewhere. So anyway, so the idea is like you have this idea that, yeah, okay, you can pursue your rights, your freedoms, but these are freedoms from things, not freedoms to do things necessarily all the time. There's the commercial aspect. And so you have this more of a, I don't want to say proposition nation necessarily, but it leaves America open to that idea, which then takes root. And because it's an expanding, it's territorially expanding, and then you have the industrialization aspect. There are lots of people who are being imported to fill that need. On the other side of the coin, though, you have, I guess you'd call it like proto-Marxist, cultural Marxist ideas in the French Revolution with a liberty, equality, fraternité. This idea that absolute equality. And we're going to take a sort of Bolshevik bloodletting to equalize down and start purging dissidents. And, it disintegrates very rapidly. And we see this time and again, whenever, quote, true communism is implemented, this idea of, perpetual year zero, take down the statues, take down everything that is symbolic or connects the people to their past must be destroyed, severed, and there must be a purge, and it demands ideological purity. And, they are actually two sides of the same coin. Unfortunately, it's just one has a very bloody and savage beginning. The American experiment, though, because it is in fact predicated on notions that are somewhat esoteric compared to like blood and soil, you're going to run into issues further down the line. Gregory Hood has written a lot on this. It's really interesting about the logical consequences of equality. The difference between the two ultimately is that what happened in the French Revolution in the 1790s basically took like 250 years to happen in America, where we're starting to see the exact same thing. Although, to be fair, the Civil War is probably very similar to that in a lot of ways too.
I was going to ask too, if you've read and factored into Tocqueville about this, where I think he came over to the States in the 1830s. It was definitely only within the first few decades of America's existence. And he had a lot of good things to say, but from what I understand, he was also, even at that early juncture, and this is obviously several decades before the Civil War as well, which you just mentioned, that there was, it had, I don't want to screw it up. I don't want to try to remember details. It's a little fuzzy in my head. He had a lot of good things to say, absolutely, about Americans taking responsibility for things in their towns and things like that, and kind of the can-do attitude. But ultimately that even at that point, that transactional nature and everything being business, and you not wanting to risk your reputation by speaking out too much about something because people in your town were a potential customer. And it's funny to think of it all the way back then, before the social age, the connected age we live in now. But those social signals and pressures, I guess, were still there, according to his document, when he came over from France and did his tour of America.
Yeah, and it is interesting because you do have at least two or three Americas pretty much right from the founding. I mean, if you just look at the colonies, you've got, we talked about cheap labor, right? Well, most of America, contrary to law, is built on slavery. Not really. It's mostly built on indentured servants and people who are literally kidnapped from abroad and like worked to death. And you see very early on with Bacon's Rebellion, this huge class of people who were formerly indentured servants who really don't have much upward mobility. They're confined to very low yield farms where the major Tidewater aristocracy, neo-aristocracy, is living very well. And they go and they pretty much just violently take over the capital. Look, listen, you're going to have to make some concessions to us. This is the 17th century. This is a very different experience in the South, particularly because it culturally has tend to focus more on hierarchy, the sort of chivalric nature. It's almost more, I don't want to say French necessarily, but it's almost more like continental European in its mindset.
Yeah, I know they have heritage with the English Cavaliers as well.
Yes,
a lot of that early stuff.
Yeah, like the University of Virginia, their mascot's the Cavaliers. God knows how long that'll last for, but there's much more of that particular heritage, whereas New England and the Northeast, to a lesser extent, is much more of that hardcore East Anglian puritanical, dare I say, more democratic sort of mindset. So this is the New England town hall system.
Yeah, only New England could produce Elizabeth Warren. She's like an archetypal New England liberal.
Right. So you have, and this is the kind of interesting thing, you can get even more fine-tuned if you could break even New England down into two tiers. You've got the kind of Elizabeth Warren, utopian busybody, and then you've got the kind of really hardworking, still very democratic, kind of somewhat irreverent, kind of more blue collar or rural type person. And it's a very interesting dichotomy even within New England, but more broadly, the kind of negative aspects of New England that have been exported across the country has been this kind of utopian idea of it's where the contractual meets the kind of utopian. So that taken to its extreme, you get things where you get active intervention on the part of the North in the South's affairs. And this kind of self-determination of states' rights really is a kind of imperialistic project, the Civil War. And, it's not like they were in a position to throw stones, because again, we're talking about cheap labor. In New England, they just used child labor. They didn't have slaves. They just used like 5-year-olds in textile mills. So it's not like they were any better in terms of, owning someone. They would just use kids. The Roman Empire did this too. And when they would die in the mines, they just threw them in the early version of a dumpster. So a lot of this stuff's been kind of blanched out of history. But anyway, this project, this kind of social justice project, this is an ongoing thing that's driven by this puritanical strain. But by the same token, the kind of counter-puritanical, or almost along the same kind of stock, you have people like Madison, Grant, and Lothrop Stoddard in the 1920s, who are basically the same genetic pool as these other folks, but they're the ones spearheading the restrictions to preserve the balance of the United States. So it's very much a duality even within kind of New England. But as different as those two strains of the same stock are, they're nothing compared to the way, again, like Southern culture would organize itself versus Northern culture. And as I mentioned, even within Southern culture, you have kind of the Appalachian type folks versus the more sort of aristocratic and hierarchical mindset and way of doing things. And the difference is obviously genetic, right? You have more of the Scotch-Irish in the Appalachian Mountains versus a more of a English, and they would have been derived more from like aristocratic bloodlines, and the landholders and stuff.
Tidewater. We're talking about Virginia, Jason. Anything you'd like to add about this as our Southerner?
Well, yeah, of course. Indeed, there are differences here across the South, but even in Virginia itself. And I have witnessed those sorts of things that John is talking about there. And there is a bit more of a bent that survives. Of course, these are the hues of Western civilization that we talk about often, Jared, with slightly different hues that we see that the spirit of the West has within itself, and therefore comes through us into our world. But all of these things, I mean, even when we're talking about New England and some of these radically anti-white personalities seemingly entire groups of people. These people could be just as radically white positive, and that's where we want them to be. We want to take back from the anti-whites in general these communities of ours that would otherwise be fanatical for any other set of ideas, and turn them away. We also talk about these. From time to time, these people who might not necessarily be the best minded, because they maybe necessarily wouldn't have been alive today hadn't it been for the great work of our geniuses. But they too even can be redeemed, many of them, and we hope absolutely we hope to do so. And John was talking about we like to say here, the dyssynergistic effects. Where we are less than the sum of our parts. Certainly it's a result of multiracialism is dyssynergistic. We are always less than the sum of our parts, if for no other reason, because we have to harmonize the diversity. We have to harmonize the multiracialism, which takes a great amount of intelligence, strength, liquidity, etc., just to be able to get along, just to be able to enable these different groups and biospirits to function in the same area. And of course, we have to always have this victim group. I don't want this conversation to go without mentioning that even when we are talking about economics, it is not, and this is yesterday we mentioned on PWR briefly, that economics does not take place in a void. It doesn't take place in a laboratory. It is taking place in an anti-white milieu, an anti-white context, an anti-white religious fervor. And I mentioned yesterday, everyone knows that that I'm not a big fan of capitalism, or laissez-faire capitalism, or crony capitalism, however you want to phrase it. Nonetheless, early capitalism, which didn't need an ever-expanding population, functioned within the context of a Christian moral ethic, or morality, and business ethic. And that, of course, you can say when it comes to Christianity, and you should say that that morality was informed by our biospirit. So irrespective of where it may have come, it became a product of who we were. And within that context, within that milieu, capitalism and maybe other forms of economy that are even around today would have been able to function in a way that served the well-being of our people. But once that morality, that Christian morality, that white morality, was supplanted by anti-white morality, once the financiers had defeated religion, specifically Christianity, and replaced our morality or our ethics with this new anti-white morality or ethics, then we saw what potentially, and this would be something perhaps for John to explore in future articles and discussions that he has, maybe even more future books, whether or not capitalism per se, or whatever we had, and whatever name you want to specifically give to it, a version of capitalism, whether or not it actually needed an expanding body of producers and consumers, or if that was just an excuse given to bring in many millions of non-white and mostly anti-white people to replace the population by rulers. You were talking in your book, this is a magnificent book, folks, and you should reach out and purchase this before the anti-whites make it impossible or very difficult for you to get. And it is The God That Failed, Liberalism and the Destruction of the West, by our very own John Q. Publius. And he talks a bit in there about a government, or in this case, I think meaning more than just government there, more than just the mechanical body, but the actual individuals who have the power, playing God. He says, playing God and changing and deciding upon a population. That there's no mistaking here that these individuals feel no connection to us. I think I know that many of them are not even white. They're not Westmen, but the ones that are anti-white, and they're not bringing in talented people from Germany. They're not bringing in talented people from Sweden. They're bringing in folks from other parts of the world. And if you think, for example, there are plenty of our brothers and sisters in very economically challenging countries in Central Eastern Europe, Southern Europe, who have every bit the same education as individuals from India or these other countries where they extract a great number of human beings and bring them to the West, have the exact same education, would be able to fit in much more easily with our population here in the United States and in Canada and in elsewhere, where they are bringing these folks in, and yet these and they would be able to pay them just as little as they would be able to pay people from India or some of these other South American countries, because these people live in are destitute. You know, they live in poverty relative to the average standard of living in the United States. So this isn't a matter clearly of just bringing in other people and needing an ever expanding population to sustain the current iteration of capitalism, or whatever you want to call it today. But indeed, I think potentially, and this is something to explore, this is just an excuse that we need an ever-growing population to feed this machine, so as to arrive at this destination of bringing in non-white people, many of whom will be anti-white, to inflict injury on Western kind merely by their presence. Even if they were all law-abiding and lovely people, eventually the presence of their biospirit would be big enough for them to have numerical courage. They would project that biospirit onto our environment and irrevocably change our countries to be something different than what we have made them to be. Of course, I'm a bit cantankerous in this way. I always feel the need to mention the anti-white nature of these sorts of things. But we do have a couple of questions, and we're running out of time, ladies and gentlemen. So if you have any financial gifts you would like to give, Cash App and Entropy are the place to do them. Otherwise, you can tag me as No White Guilt on the channel. It will show up orange for me. And or you could tag Mr. George with any questions that you have for either of us and or our luminous guest, John Q. Publius. And we have here Volkish Warrior asking a question, and I will present this. I think he's asking it of me, but I'm not sure that I can speak to it, at least obliquely, but we'll give it to John, because I think maybe he'll have some thoughts on it. It says here, please speak to the quote of the late Algerian president. Is it Bonamentinde? Something like this. And it says here, quote, one day, millions of men will leave the southern hemisphere to go to the northern hemisphere, and they will not go there as friends, but because they will go there to conquer it, and they will conquer it with their sons. The wombs of our women will give us victory. So this is directly connected to what we were talking about, the expanding population. And what role do you see, John, of the sort of confluence of a context in which our business owners have to compete with each other by way of cheap labor, or the contrary, hiring Americans, which would cost a lot more, certainly white Americans, and this desire of non-white peoples from around the world to head to the United States for a better economic life, etc. And how do you see that unfolding as the country continues? We just had the American, Mexican, and Canadian Act that has come to fruition and is now being applied. And I did a very brief video on that. And one of the things that they are permitting there is the free movement in this treaty, the free movement of labor, as long as you can be considered participating in a trade. You don't have to get citizenship. You can just go live in the country, work in the country, bring your family, and those in the country have to pay the taxes for you. They have to continue to pay the roads for you to use, the schools for you to use, and that sort of thing. So if you could speak to this, brother, please go ahead.
Yeah, sure, absolutely. Well, I think it definitely is the kind of impulse to, get a better life in some ways, but it's also sort of an unearned benefit, right? So you kind of mentioned this idea. Well, it's different context too. So like in terms of Europe, there's the age-old civilizational question of the Muslim populations and the Christian populations kind of clashing. And this is, 1400-year context to consider. And then in North America, this is is less pronounced. It does, it is a factor, but this kind of huge pool of individuals from Central America that they are trying to pull up here to fill the so-called labor gap. I mean, as we saw with coronavirus, we've got 40 million jobs that just went up in smoke, in addition to all of the other people who are not actively involved in the labor force. So if that was actually, kind of similar to what you were saying earlier, if that was actually like the true need, then you would, and it was a responsible government, you would look to that pool of people to try and give them adequate training to fill those roles. But it is both economic and ideological. So these tradespeople, yes, they'll work for less. They will. The fact that they're a burden on the state is inconsequential from the private sphere, so-called perspective, because the taxpayer is basically underwriting their own dispossession, and that's really one of the most insidious things about the whole system as it's constructed. So not only are they holding a virtual monopoly in the marketplace, and any kind of marketplace, be Dave Rubin's marketplace of ideas, man, or the ability to go and buy a book somewhere. This is a total control where they're trying to get really a monopoly on all of the resources and the ability for you to acquire those resources. And then the idea that then this huge tax burden that we're subjected to goes to subsidize all of these people coming in and undercutting our own wages and destroying the social capital of our own communities. It's really, it's a very insidious thing. And I think that, as I said, it is true that these populations do have much higher birth rates. They tend to decline through the generations as they come to the West, and so they need to have a constant source of these people being pumped in order to fill that gap. So it's again, there's a lot of different things going on with that, but that quote is an interesting one because it does evidence a particular other ideological aspect, the religious / civilizational conflict. And there are a fair number of adherents that are looking at this as, Christendom is momentarily weakened, and this is a chance for us to bring more territory into the sphere of our particular ideology. And so there's that wrinkle to it. It's not like everyone who's being imported has the exact same mindset. Some of them are, religious warriors. Some of them are economic opportunists. Some of them are just, people who are there to soak up the benefits. There's other people who come, they genuinely want a better life. There's a whole slew of factors and different types of people that are being brought in terms of what their motivations are. But it's all generally done to fracture and atomize the host population. And so the people, whether they're jihadis or they're just moving to, work as masons, from the ruling class's perspective, it's basically irrelevant because it's all going to have a deleterious effect on the social capital of the host nations, which benefits them in terms of social control, again, keeps the native birth rates lower. The financial burden creates such a situation that's very difficult to afford to have multiple children if you're a more high investment parenting population. There's natural crime because different groups have different behavioral impulses. And that in turn gets people into these better consumers, but also a more pliant population, more easily controlled population. So it all kind of dovetails with there on this. Really, it's an invasionary force. It's really the only way to look at it. Whether they're economic migrants or they're actually militarized people from ISIS or something.
And that, ladies and gentlemen, is the lumosity of John Q. Publius. You just listened to a magnificent discussion we've had with this gentleman and his book right now available to you, The God That Failed, Liberalism and the Destruction of the West. I really like what it says here at the end of the overview. Quote, "The God that failed will drag the hideous, nameless system into the light and expose its hypocrisy, lies, and destruction." So make sure that you reach out and you get this book at first opportunity, because we know right now with the powers that the tech companies, and I assume this sort of leeway will be given to pretty much any entity that can claim some aspect of it being tech. They will have the freedom to censor anything they want without any recourse whatsoever, thanks to this new trade agreement. So make sure you reach out and get this book now. Again, you won't be able to find John's links below unless there's a YouTube link, because we get strikes when we post links, unlike everybody else on YouTube. So those links, though, will be accessible to you all on both Jared George's website, that's thegreatorder.com, on my website, knowwhyguilt.org, and on our joint website, which is where we want you all to go. Certainly, if we suddenly disappear, you will continue to be able to find us over at theafterparty.tv. And as you can see, John here is most conversant in these matters that we address today, and there are others, and that's why we like having him on. And in fact, he is he's such a regular that we consider him a guest host on tap, and we love having John, and we will absolutely have him back again in the future. Before we wrap up here, there is some really good news. There is an auspice that I want to share with you all in just a moment. But before we do, I want to get any of John's final thoughts, and if he could, let us know where he can find you, brother. And don't be afraid to say it. We just can't post it in the description. And especially for those who will be listening on Spreaker in replay, they won't be able to see it anyhow. So where we can find you, what projects you're working on, and what projects you will be working on next, brother. Please go ahead.
Well, okay. So you can find me on Twitter at anatomicallyok. You can go to my blog, theanatomicallycorrectbanana.com. The first book is The Way Life Should Be, ? That's available through Ostara, Ostara Publications. That one has not been banned from Amazon, to the best of my knowledge. You can get that through Barnes & Noble or the publisher. The order of the day today is The God That Failed, Liberalism and the Destruction of the West. You can get that as well on Barnes & Noble or through the publisher, which is Black House Publishing. And those are pretty much the main places you could find me. Otherwise, really, I'm just encouraging people to try to stay safe and steer clear of the mobs right now, because people are getting very hysterical and violent.
Do you want to give a quick pitch as to give us a little taste of what's available in the book? How I know, without saying too much on YouTube, that you go into more detail in the book about what's going on with everything we discussed tonight.
Yeah, I think, it'll be intriguing for people, I think, to start reading the stuff that I've mentioned, particularly about the confluence of economics, identity, ideology, and how the ruling class is kind of manipulating people into doing its bidding. I think that it's particularly when they get to the latter part of the economic section, they'll find a few things that they really did not, maybe they suspected, but to see in such plain detail, I think they'll find very illuminating.
And I was glad to see when I ordered your first book, The Way Life Should Be on Main, in May, it was a little bit delayed, but for a very good reason. It had already been sold out on Amazon. So I was happy to see that. It did come in just a few weeks. It wasn't too long of a wait. And now I'm going to have to order this one. And before you know it, I'm sure you'll be back on discussing your third book. Maybe we will have you on, of course, for other discussions as well. It's always a pleasure to speak with you. I know some people in the chat were talking about maybe getting into the finer details of capitalism, going on with what Jason said in the latter part of the show. We might want to pick your brain on how there's tenets of capitalism that reflect our instincts or could be beneficial, if there's a way to kind of suss those out and incorporate them into a more homogenous one, like nation as family being the first principle, wrapped in that. So that's a teaser for maybe something else we could talk about, to kind of put that in the back of your head.
Yeah, that's in the conclusion of the book too. I didn't want to really spoil anything, but I do offer quite a few solutions and suggestions and things as well. So it's not just me saying, here's all this bad stuff, which it is bad, but I like to end on a positive note. And, I spend quite a bit of space discussing both the metapolitical and economic things that we might do to try and, turn the ship around.
Oh, that's great. Great to hear. And glad we're on the same page. Well, yes, to reiterate again, it's always such a pleasure to talk to you. It was just flowing today. I always learn and have my mind opened, and I know that the chat did as well. So everyone, as Jason said, the afterparty.tv that's where you go if people are asking, what if tomorrow you go on YouTube and there's no NWG channels and there's no Jared George channel? Go to the afterparty.tv, specifically that show info page. You could see what's coming up. We would, of course, update that and change that with some info if we got more of the hammer on YouTube. We know it's only a matter of time, so please do try to get in the habit of watching directly on that site in the embedded entropy window when you can, or some of the alt tech places. It's really not about the platform. It's about this amazing community, and we're going to have to be nimble. We're going to have to be a movable feast. But my own site's thegreatorder.com. That's how you can see what I'm doing, different projects, the videos, and otherwise, ways to support, ways to contact my social media if you're not following or subscribed to on other platforms. Always appreciate it. But there's more good stuff coming up. With Jason, we've been doing so many shows on Fridays and Saturdays. I have to keep reminding myself it's Thursday, right? But tomorrow there's a Chuck Martell. So that's the Music and Arts Party Jason puts on. And let us know what time that is, Jason. And please do the honors of taking us out.
I will indeed. Thank you so much, good brother. Well, tomorrow at 7 p.m. Eastern Standard Time. Set your clocks accordingly wherever you are on planet Earth. Make sure that you can be with us for the Chuck Martell Party, where we feature the magnificent artists, rising stars in the white positive sphere, the best you'll find anywhere in our corner of the universe. So make sure you all are able to make it to that. It'll be a couple of videos, a couple of songs. I'm sure you'll see something by Raymond Foster, since he is some kind of Herculean Superman down under doing some magnificent things for White Wellbeing with no white guilt signs. Very impressed with all of that. Very impressed with all of you. I'm proud of all of you. And I want to tell you this all, that there is an auspice that is coming soon. A good omen is what that is, an auspice. It is coming soon. Something very exciting, something coming very soon. And there'll be changes in the world. And I'm unable to say much more than that. But all is not bad at the moment. Things are changing, and you all will see quite soon. Also, later on tonight at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time, there will be a premiere of my discussion over on James Fox Higgins' channel here on YouTube, 8 o'clock p.m. Eastern Standard Time. James and I had a fantastic conversation. You'll be able to see it then, and I should be in the live chat with you all during that. Let me get we saw a spotlight, put a spotlight on a couple of the folks I saw in the chat. I saw G.A. Patriot, and I saw Underhill out there. Big spotlight and salute to the both of you. I also saw our good friend Nike's Ghost was here today. Tony was also, I saw at one point in the live chat. It is magnificent to see all of you. A big thank you to everyone who participated in the live chat today and asked questions and gave their thoughts on the subject matter that we were discussing. A big thank you, of course, to our magnificent guest, John Q. Publius, whom we will have back very soon. And a big thank
Quick note, Jason, sorry to cut you off, but people are asking in the chat. I'm going to put the link to John's book in the chat right now.
Ah, very good. That'll make it easy for everybody to head on over there and find it. Otherwise, of course, ladies and gentlemen, we would have had it in the description, but for our wonderful friends over at YouTube with their magnificent purple hair and other things they have going on, and they're just waiting for an off-platform site to be left in the description that is that is not usual for the description. So it'd be unusual there, and then they'll say, "Here's your strike again." So that is why our hands are tied there. But thank you all very much for being here. And a big thank you to Mr. George and all the efforts that he makes to ensure that these TAP episodes are edifying and entertaining for every single one of you. But ladies and gentlemen, once again, please get excited, because there is big change. I wish I could share with you all, but I'll just let you know, and maybe I'll be able to share a little bit more on Sunday. But really get excited. There's a lot bad that's right now going on in the world, but there is great change that we are influencing coming very soon to a town near you. And we look forward to seeing you all next time.